I'm going to introduce Representative Strickland, but first, I would like to do a little shout out to Dante Payne, who is the representative's deputy district director here in Lacey. It's always been a pleasure to work with Dante, and we just are so grateful for his patience, for his sense of humor, and his professionalism. So I just particularly want Representative Strickland to know about that. Okay, so now I'll introduce the representative. Representative Strickland is the Congresswoman for the CD10. She was raised in the South Sound area. She was elected to the Tacoma City Council and is also the former mayor of the city of Tacoma, with a position she held for 8 years. She's finishing her first term in Congress. As I say, this is a first term, so I'm thinking, given everything that's happened in the last term, in the last 2 years, she must think that this term is 100 years long, but but it's been a doozy. And so we are so glad to have a chance to talk with you, Representative Strickland. And if you'd like to go ahead, please do.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. And thank you to, I will just call you all the South Sound Indivisible groups. It's an honor to be here today. And, to your point earlier, I'm a freshman in Congress. I ran for Congress during a pandemic. I was sworn in during a pandemic when there really wasn't much response to it. And I tell folks that, I can't believe that it's already almost 2 years, and I can't believe it's only 2 years. We've been through a lot. And I like to just kind of go back and talk about my experience at first. So, I ran in a very competitive race. I came out on top. I won by 14 points, and I was sworn in on January 3rd, 2021. It was a Sunday evening. And I remember, typically when you get sworn into Congress for the first time, it's a really big deal for your family. People come out, you get to meet the speaker, you pose for a picture. They have lots of activities for freshman members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. So you get to know each other. So they take you to the Library of Congress, you visit Gettysburg. So it's just kind of a nice introduction, like, welcome to DC, welcome to Congress. We know you belong to various parties, but here's a chance for you and your families and your spouses to get to know each other. We did none of that. So when I was sworn in on January 3rd, it was a very long evening, waiting around to finally be sworn in. And for those of you who may have seen the proceedings or some of the press clippings, I wore a traditional Korean dress, which is called hanbok. And hanbok is worn for very special occasions for women of Korean descent. People often wear them to weddings, they wear them to graduations. And I said, well, this is the biggest stage of my life, so I'm going to wear hanbok on the House floor. 3 days later, there was the failed coup attempt to overturn the results of the legitimate election. I was not in the Capitol when it happened. I was down the street in my office, but watching it unfold in real time was really surreal. And typically, certifying an election that has been certified by all 50 secretaries of state is kind of a routine thing. And as you know, there was an attempt to overturn the legitimate election. A week later, the Democrats filed articles of impeachment. And a week later, we had the peaceful transfer of power where Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn in. But I remember Hakeem Jeffries saying it was 3 Wednesdays in January. That was the introduction to the 117th Congress. With that said, we've gotten a lot done. We passed the American Rescue Plan. We were very diligent about getting vaccines to people, doing what we could to make sure that shots got into arms. The American Rescue Plan had a child tax credit that brought 40% of families in our district out of poverty. It got money into the hands of families so they could stay housed. It helped businesses stay open. So it did a lot. And then after that, we ended up passing the CHIPS Act. We ended up passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which has the centerpiece of reducing the cost of prescription drugs and allowing insulin to be sold with a cap of $35 a month. Those policies have been worked on for over 20 years. So it's interesting to be in this election cycle where what you see happening is local issues are being nationalized. And I was watching part of the debate yesterday where Senator Murray was being held responsible for every crime, every person who's not securely housed, and a bunch of local issues. And so as we think about, moving forward in this election cycle, and people I know on this call have heard me say this, there's so much at stake in this election cycle. If the Democrats do not hold the majority, if we do not expand our majority in the House or actually get away from the tie, there will be a lot of rollbacks happening. And I tell people this election is a difference between freedom and oppression. It's the difference between having our civil rights and protecting them and having them taken away. But I will stop right there. I just want to thank you all for being here. I know that you all have been very active in volunteering and getting the vote out. And I just tell people for the next couple of weeks, we cannot take our foot off the gas. And I want to make sure that we're able to continue to doing the good work that we want to do for people. There are some issues that we'll talk about, including inflation and some other issues. But I just want to thank you for allowing me to be here today and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. Joni, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to take questions as they've come up. And the first person to raise his hands was Steve Otis. So we'll begin there.
Steve, you're muted.
I was going to be, sorry, I've got a little thing on my screen. I thought I was going to be a little later. Okay, so the Commercial Aircraft Aviation Coordinating Commission has identified greenfield sites for a new airport to relieve crowding at SeaTac over time. There's locations in Pierce County, two in Pierce County and one in Thurston County. There's also the possibility of adding capacity to Payne Field up in Snohomish. There's been a lot of resistance to that in both Pierce and Thurston counties. To the airport. We know that you don't have an active role in that controversy, but do you have a position on it? I also, the folks in Tacoma asked, so the Indivisibles Tacoma asked that in some places there's dual military civilian use of airports, and since the Pierce County folks have opposed both locations there. They wanted to know whether you'd work to persuade the Department of Defense to permit civilian passenger and air cargo use at McChord, and if not, why not? So there's two questions there.
Yeah, so without speaking for the entire length of this meeting, because this is a very complicated question that has many dimensions to it, and you can't answer it with a bumper sticker. So let me just try to take pieces of it. So when Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was built, and I'm still a stickler about them saying both names when they land, it was in the middle of nowhere back then. And think about when that airport was built and what the I-5 corridor looked like compared to how it looks now. It's not in the middle of nowhere anymore. It is a large urban and suburban corridor. And if those of you who have the pleasure of traveling through SeaTac, it is probably the one airport I have seen in the world, to be honest with you, that is just bursting at the seams. Every single centimeter of that airport is being used. And so there's no doubt that it is over capacity. And I remind folks that most major metro areas in the US have at least two airports, right? When you go to LA, you go to LAX or you go to Long Beach. If you go to San Francisco, you go to SFX or you go to Oakland. If you go to New York, you get three. You get Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia. So the need for an airport, I don't think is the question. I mean, do we need one? I would say yes, but I think the question becomes, what are we going to do to alleviate some of the challenges at SeaTac? And I say that because we have passenger and we have freight. And the question I would ask is there a way perhaps to divert freight and take it only to one airport so we're not having to deal with the traffic of passengers being dropped off, being picked up, standing in line? And I don't know the answer to that because I don't know what proportion of the flights are doing freight. But I think for me is, okay, if the answer is we need it, then how can we do it in the most efficient, least disruptive way? And I remind folks too, remember how long it took to add a third runway to SeaTac? It took almost 2 decades. So even adding a runway to an existing airport was controversial. So, it's pretty interesting that, I've never seen a project met so quickly with universal no's out of the gate. But I think for me, it's a matter of finding out what problems are we trying to solve? Is building another airport the best way to solve them? And where would we build it to be the least disruptive? And I think that's really the question I ask. As someone who is an advocate for high-speed rail, I know that there's the Cascade Corridor project that's going to go from Portland, Oregon to Vancouver, BC. Could that connect with the California line at some point so that we have high-speed rail travel as a way to not necessarily have to take flights? And so I have a ton of questions, probably more than you do. And you're right that Congress will not take a vote up or down on this. But, as a leader in the region, I'm going to get asked about this a lot. But I would say, honestly, I want to get through this election cycle and then think about some of these bigger bigger things that are going to be part of, our quality of life and our transportation corridor. And of course, the other question about how is this going to affect climate change? But I think that there are some other levers we can pull. I admit I have not read the full report, but I do know that resoundingly people in Pierce and Thurston County have said, no, thank you.
And what about the McCord option? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I know that a couple of years ago when we were even talking about a possible airport, that came up in conversation. And from what I understand, even my predecessor in the DOD were unequivocally no. But again, I just think that let's take a step back and talk about what problems are we trying to solve and how could we solve them? Because the big problem with SeaTac is that there are too many passengers trying to get on and off too many planes, and then the traffic nightmare of getting to and from the airport. I think those are some of the questions. Will having light rail go from Tacoma to the airport alleviate some of the challenges? And so I think there are a lot of things in play right now, but also focusing on what problems can we solve easily without necessarily having to build a giant airport somewhere in Pierce or Thurston County.
All right, thank you. That was a nice, thorough answer. Next on our list is Julie Andruski. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and I apologize in advance. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Congresswoman Strickland, for meeting with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Sure.
My question comes from an ad that was run by the Washington State Democratic Party about Medicare and the activities trying to privatize it, and a new evidently ACO REACH, accountable care organizations, which will make traditional Medicare profit-based. And yesterday when I was on the doors, a woman said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "I don't know who to ask." She said, "I see these ads on television about these different Medicare, and they have dental and hearing and these other things. And I just don't know whether to trust them or what should I do about them." And so I talked to her about what I know about these, that they are kind of scams, in my opinion, because they're trying to convince people to move off of standard Medicare to move on to a profit-based Medicare. And then I didn't even know about this this new thing that it sounds like it's already a done deal unless some action is taken. So can you just address the whole issue of profit? We don't want to have profit-based healthcare for seniors.
Yeah, so again, I'll try to keep my answers to 3 minutes for an hour-long discussion. And, and I say this because, I was a caregiver for my mother until she passed away in June, and she was 93 when she died. And I just remember the volume of mail that would come to her house that had the word Medicare on it, and then whatever else, right? You didn't even know what it was. And she would say to me, "Well, Medicare is going to change. Should we sign up for this?" I was like, absolutely not. And so even the use of the word Medicare is so confusing when you get all these things in the mail to people. But for those of you who do use Medicare, and I'll just use my uncle as an example, he is a cardiac patient. He had a quadruple bypass, and he has Medicare Advantage. He had to purchase that because Medicare alone does not cover everything he needs for his cardiac care. And so I think that, what we have to look at, number one, I oppose privatizing Medicare. It shouldn't happen. But the reality is that more people are qualified for it, more people are using the services, and we want to make sure that we always have the resources to fund it amply. One of the things that we wanted to do through the Inflation Reduction Act was have Medicare negotiate the cost of prescription drugs. That's going to be really good for the entire system because it's going to save money. And so I think part of the things we have to do is think about how do we find ways to support the beneficiaries of Medicare who paid into the system, but also do what we can to make sure that it's efficient and we have ample funding to keep providing services. But I would say that, these different, I'll call them scams that are coming through the mail about sign up for this, sign up for that, it is incredibly confusing for people. And so I support keeping Medicare public because that's what it should be. But I also need to ask the question of why do people have to purchase supplemental to get the coverage they need? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And you will see a lot of different organizations and people using the name Medicare to try to sell you something. And I think that really warrants just kind of a beware message for seniors, because people sometimes don't know the difference. They want to sign up for something. And some of these companies know that seniors are vulnerable if they don't have an advocate for them in their home. And so I do not support privatizing Medicare, but I want to make sure that it is thorough and it provides the coverage that people need.
Does it have to be stopped though? This ACO REACH, it sounds like it's automatically going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, ACO REACH was conceived as a way for groups of doctors to provide more efficient care. I think what ended up happening is that people realized that there was a private portion to this. And when you hear the word hedge fund, it's a trigger for a lot of people because they think it's vultures coming in to basically profit off of people's illness. And so I think the question I would ask is, what was the intent of this ACO? Is it going to be better so that it does exactly what it's supposed to do? And if it isn't, then we shouldn't have it there.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Next on the list is Dennis Larkin.
Good morning. Thank you, Representative Strickland. I really appreciate your opening comments, very succinct, and I appreciate you using direct language like coup, because it was an attempted coup, in my opinion.
It was.
My question may go off in a little different way. I'm interested in asking you a little bit about foreign policy.
Okay.
Most of my career was working in international schools outside the US. Recently, my concerns about MBS in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, recently Representatives Malinowski, Baston and Wild have introduced a bill that would mandate removal of US troops and missile defense systems from Saudi and the UAE, and would relocate the equipment and other defense systems in other areas in the Middle East to protect US troops. And I think that's a good start. I personally don't think it goes far enough. So my question is about the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Would you support those sales being terminated? Representative Strickland, the US arms sales is a particular concern to me. I have lived in Saudi Arabia for 5 years, and as a member of the American Business Group, sat around the table with what I call arms dealers, essentially representatives of armed merchants that were from the US and UK. The idea that Saudi would not be persuaded by any leverage we might act in terms of arms sales to Saudi, I think is a red herring. Up to 80% of their of their security forces are already embedded with US systems. So the sort of straw man that they'll just go to China and Russia, I don't think is valid, but that's my view. But my question is, what is your position on Saudi Arabia, the recent hike or downgrading the production of oil and the impact it's having? And what positions would you advocate for the US taking in this particular area of foreign policy?
So the bill that was introduced with my colleagues was a response to Saudi Arabia basically cutting oil production by 2 million barrels a day. And so there was a desire to say, well, if you're not going to be a true partner to us, then we're going to basically penalize you. And so the question really becomes, these missile defense systems that we're selling, is it justifiable to still sell them to them given what they did to us? And I will just tell you honestly, it is a very complicated relationships. As you know, around the world, we have allies, but we also have interests. And so I will obviously take a look at this policy. I'm not an expert on Saudi relationships, but I will definitely take a look at it and talk to my colleagues. I mean, the group of people who have co-sponsored this bill includes someone who served in the military. It's someone who's ex-CIA. So it wasn't like something that just people without expertise came up with out of thin air. But I think it's something that's worthy of looking into. But I will take a look at it, talk to my national security staff and see where we stand on it. But I do know it was a direct response to them saying that they were going to reduce production of oil and how that will basically hurt us, in that part of the world, given what's going on with Russia and Ukraine and the gas prices that we're paying. And for those of you on the call who don't know this, when we talk about the price of gas, oil is a global commodity traded on a global market. And so even though it's being sold at prices that are pretty comparable to what they've been for a long time, it is the oil companies that are basically gouging us by charging more to their retailers who jack up the prices at the pump. And so, as you all know, it's a very complicated conversation, but it's not as though there is a policy that a president can just enact, or even Congress can enact, to say, boom, prices go down. We're doing a lot right now with strategic reserves. We're trying to, we tried to pass a bill that was really holding oil companies accountable for price gouging. Every Democrat voted for it, just about. Every Republican voted against it. But we're just trying to really, help people understand that this is a global phenomenon, but we're doing everything we can to drive down, not just the cost of gas, but the cost of living. But the cost of gas has an effect on so much that we do.
Okay, thank you. Kit Burns, you have a question?
Good morning, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland. I have a dozen. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. I have about a dozen questions, and I'll try and keep them down small. I want to address Medicare really quickly, and then Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
And on Medicare, just bring to everybody's attention, Ro Khanna has introduced a bill in Congress, and that's to rename Medicare to prevent its use from being used deceptively as it is being used now. And he wants to change it to Alternative Private Health Plan and take that name out. The name of, or the use of Medicare was brought in during the Bush administration. So that's a bill that's in Congress now. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And I totally agree with that. The issue I have on Medicare, there was a great hearing by Senator Elizabeth Warren on February 2nd on the Finance Committee, Health Committee, and it's about 2 hours long, but it really goes into some of the problems with Medicare Health. Medicare program, when it was privatized or brought into being privatized, said it would save money, much like the ACO REACH program is supposed to save money.
Yeah.
But it's shown to cost more than $110 billion just in the last 10 years. But the name of her hearing was something to the effect of the future of the Medicare program. And she talks about it. You listen to it and you find out that it seems that the pharmaceutical companies are racketeering. They pay to delay the introduction of competitive pricing. And my own personal opinion is it's like they're looting the Medicare program because you can't negotiate prices on them. So that's the kind of background for that. But let me point to my primary question, and that's on removing the cap from Social Security. It's called Scrap the Cap.
Yep.
And there's a bill in Congress now, which you're familiar with, the Social Security 2100 Act. I would like to see that bill split into two. One is to increase the taxation, in other words, strengthen Social Security financially, because as a senior now, I call it elder abuse. When, I keep getting things about, oh, Social Security is going broke, oh, it's not going to function. And the Koch brothers and many other foundations get away with tricking the young people and our seniors that it's going broke and it's not going to last. And a simple solution isn't raising the age of retirement. It's just simply scrapping the cap.
Yep.
And it would be taxed, not only raise the taxes on wages, but also raise the tax on compensation. So that would include stock pricing. Would you consider introducing a single separate bill to simply strengthen Social Security?
Yeah, so Kit, I do support the raising the cap part or eliminating it altogether. And when it comes to, the percentage that we're taxing, I think it kind of depends on, I would like to hear more about that. And I say that because I think sometimes we say, okay, well, if you make a certain amount, you must be living a certain lifestyle. And I say that as someone who comes from a community of color. Sometimes we're often the first in our family. So we may make a certain income, but we got a payroll that's pretty big. We're taking care of our elders. We're taking care of other members of our family. And so I think the cap part of it would be the most fair and equitable way to take this, because right now I think it's capped at like 120,000.
147,000.
147,000. But I think raising that or getting rid of it altogether is really smart. The other thing too, I think we need to point out, and this is absolutely true, and it's going to seem like a weird segue, but when Social Security was first created, our life expectancy was a lot lower. And for every person collecting benefits, there were 16 people contributing into the system. That number is now 4 to 1. So as we look at how we're going to continue to have more people paying into Social Security, we have people in this country who are not citizens, but have lived here most of their lives, who work and pay taxes, and we have to find a way to get them into a path of citizenship. And we have to be more open-minded about immigration reform, because our birth rate is lower, people are living longer, and the ratio has changed. So what are we doing aside from raising that cap or eliminating it, Kit, to get more people paying into the system? I think that's really important as well. But I do agree with you that, you hear a lot of scare tactics where we're going to have to raise the retirement age or do all these different things. And I don't think that's necessarily viable. Let's raise the cap. Let's make sure that more people are paying into Social Security so that it continues to stay solid.
One other thing I just looked up recently was when the Social Security program was introduced in 1935, the amount that the person contributing would be 1% of their salary and the employer would put 1%.
Right.
Now we're all contributing 6.2%.
Yep.
And the employer contributes 6.2%.
Yep.
So that argument is often used like we have fewer people putting into it, but we need to understand we're also paying more.
Yep, absolutely.
And what I would like to see, and this is why I suggest a simple separate bill, one, it is something a person can campaign on. It'll separate the wheat from the chaff, as I would call it.
Mm-hmm.
And you support this strengthening Social Security through funding. And so if we start with funding, then we can figure out how to spend the remaining.
Yep, absolutely.
So thank you for paying attention to that.
Thank you, Kit.
I'm
Nice to see
going to
you.
bug you on it again too, so expect to hear from me again.
I
Thank
will.
you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kit. And we have some chat people who've asked about questions, so we're going to start with Bill Van Hook. Bill, are you? Yeah.
And now I'm unmuted. Again, this is a question, Representative Strickland, about Social Security. Kevin McCarthy has laid out the Republican priorities if they gain the House majority. And one of them is either to sunset Social Security or significantly change the program through means testing, increasing the age for qualification, or privatizing it. Do the Democrats have any plan on how to counter his agenda?
Well, I'd say the most immediate plan is to hold our majority in the House and to increase the Senate. And I'd say the other thing too that I've observed is that Kevin McCarthy may say some things because he thinks that they throw red meat to his base, but I don't even think he can get his own caucus to agree on something like that. And so I think, our first line of defense, honestly, is to win and to make sure that we can continue doing the good work. And if the Republicans are going to propose something like that, I don't believe their majority is even going to be large enough, let alone getting it through the Senate. And so, we as Democrats will continue to protect and defend Social Security against anything that's going to harm people, harm recipients, and take away the benefits that people have been paying into for a long time.
Okay, I have a very short follow-up, and that has to do with what he said. And he is talking about holding the country hostage by stopping an increase in the debt ceiling. And one of those things would be to negotiate this specific kind of thing, is cutting benefits to people on social programs. Has the Democrat caucus talked about raising the debt ceiling during the lame duck session?
Yeah, it's come up. And, I would say that, God, there was someone who I served with whose name escapes me, and he just even talked about the whole conversation about the debt ceiling should not be a legislative decision. That should just be something that is handled administratively, because their job is to make sure that we can pay our bills and keep government going. So I actually support that bill. I have not heard much about it lately, but I will come back to my observation about, Kevin McCarthy making threats on Social Security. He probably forgets that a lot of people he represents are beneficiaries of Social Security themselves. And so again, I don't know that he has that much control over his caucus. He would actually be hurting a lot of people that he represents. But I know that there has been a bill to talk about the debt ceiling and saying that should not be a legislative issue. That should be an administrative issue that a responsible person who understands government finances does on their own. So I think there are a couple of options that we have with that. But the hostage taking thing is just absurd.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next up, we have Meredith Rafferty, who has a question.
Representative Strickland, I'd like to speak from the perspective of that extended family with family members who are still working and raising families. And I would like to thank you very much for your continued support of reproductive rights and personal privacy on behalf of families. But my question is around taking credit. Democrats delivered on a massive infrastructure bill legislation as we were coming out of the pandemic. Is probably could you comment, is it a critical part of where we stand today in terms of employment? What jobs for families did you see come in to Puget Sound?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So what's happening right now with the economy, and the focus is obviously going to be on what are we paying for things, because everyone's family is feeling the effect of that, whether you pump gas, when you go buy groceries, or even when you buy food in a restaurant. But to your point about the things that we have accomplished, there probably are about 25,000 new jobs in the 10th district alone based on the bills that we have passed. And with the infrastructure bill, it's one of those words that you can't slap on a bumper sticker, right? And so when we talk about, we're going to create good jobs by making sure that our systems have clean water, that we're investing more in mass transit, that we're expanding our electric vehicle charging stations, that we're going to repair roads and bridges, that we're going to expand high-speed broadband, especially in communities that don't have it. And we learned this during the pandemic with a lot of kids trying to do online learning and just not being successful at it. And so I think that, there's so many things that we're working on. The money from the infrastructure bill is on a 5-year plan. And so every year, every state will get a tranche of money. So Washington State will get $8 billion altogether from the infrastructure bill. But you're right. It's creating jobs. It is working on things that we know can be done to improve the quality of life, things that are long overdue. But also too, we have a workforce issue right now. 2 million women left the workforce during the pandemic because we could not find childcare, elder care, or care for our disabled loved ones. And I don't know how many people have returned back, but the caregiving industry itself is a pillar of our economy. And it is my hope that in the 118th Congress, we're going to be able to come up with a federal child care and caregiving plan, because if we want this economy to have full participation, we have to address that. We have to pay those positions well enough so that people want to go into them and stay there. We have to have training. And then we also have to make sure that people have access to it, because access to caregiving is probably one of the biggest barriers to full economic participation. And we have to address that if we're going to have a full economy. So for me, it's yes, and the infrastructure bill did a lot to create jobs. We still have jobs that are not filled. And someone told me this the other day. They said that if every person who could work in the United States filled every position, we would still have a shortage of workers. And this is where I pivot back to comprehensive immigration reform to help us fill jobs in every single sector, from healthcare to ag to high tech, you name it. We just need more workers. And we have to stop sending the message that we've tried to do in the last couple of years, that the United States is hostile to immigrants, or that if you come here, it's a dangerous place. I know someone in Korea who was considering working in the US, and she asked me, is it safe there? Is it safe for me? Anti-Asian hate crimes, gun violence. This is how people in different places of the world are sometimes viewing us, and we have to change that narrative.
Yes, and I'll be your partner in that if there are things that we can do in our communities to change that image, because that is what I see also.
Yeah.
That as communities, we are functioning far better than our national media would lead us to believe, or our national candidates would lead us to believe.
Yeah, that's true. And this is why the work that you do at the local grassroots level is so incredibly important, because this is real life. This is real life here at home.
Then we need real facts that we can talk to too.
Yeah,
so I've noted some of the ones that you've said. Can we follow up with your office and get some salient facts about the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of that, how that translates to our communities and our families.
Yeah, and I will just I'll just editorialize
Not to be
here a
totally
bit.
wonky, but just something to slip in there that this is how it all ties together.
Yeah, well, I'm going to editorialize a bit here and just tell you that, you know, when I first got into politics back in 2007, you got your news from 3 sources: the TV, the radio, and the newspaper. There are a bazillion ways to get your information right now. And it is so easy to find a lane that only confirms what you believe. And that makes it hard to have the nuanced debates and give and take and conversations about how we solve some of our big problems. I mean, that it just makes it hard to govern. It really does. And so again, I'm just hopeful that, you know, we're able to be successful in this election cycle and keep forging ahead for the American people. But sometimes, you know, a bumper sticker is not a sufficient answer to a complicated problem, but somehow it's been reduced to that.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not. But maybe in daily conversations, just slipping in and reinforcing, don't believe all those big bumper stickers.
Right.
You know, here's what's really going on.
Thank you for the question, though.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have David Lovell. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes. Thank you for taking my question. I had to leave for California for 7 years, and I lived in Napa and Sacramento. And then I came back here and noticed how much worse the I-5 corridor has been. When I worked for the UW, I often commuted to Olympia, and now I live in Olympia. And I don't understand why Amtrak has not made the same arrangement between Seattle and Olympia that it makes between Sacramento and San Francisco. And the train that Amtrak does not run into San Francisco, but you take a train, you get off across the bay, and the bus is waiting for you and takes you all the way to the city. Here, if you get off the train in Olympia and you don't live here, what do you have to do? Call a cab, wait for a local bus to come by and take 25 minutes to get into town? We are adding much more commuting time between these two cities than we need to, because we don't have train service that goes straight from Seattle to downtown Olympia. And that should be possible. I don't know why it's not happened yet.
So let me try to, again, give you a short answer to a lengthy situation. So when we talk about, I mean, and not just Amtrak, because there's Sound Transit, right? And Sound Transit right now does not include Thurston County as part of their taxing district. So that's one way to address the issue, is to bring Thurston County into the Sound Transit district and then have them pay into it and start to build out. That could take forever, you know that. And the other thing about, you know, investing in transit is typically something that is based on population density and ridership. Ridership justifies every dollar that we spend. What I often tell folks, however, is that what we can do here in the South Sound is be proactive and kind of not do what happened in King County, where they are building after the fact to address all these traffic problems. And, you know, I would say a few things need to happen. You know, I would say that with the pandemic, more people are having flexible work situations where you don't have to physically go up and down the I-5 corridor. I think that's important. I would also say too, you know, I know that intercity transit, for example, has added like free bus service. But I think to your point is, you know, we have to invest more in transit options, because there's going to come a point where I'm not going to want to drive anymore. And so we have to get used to the fact that as our population ages and more people want to use public transit, it's going to be a more viable option for more people. So what are we doing, whether it's Amtrak, Sound Transit, intercity transit? How are we expanding those options for people? The other thing I'll say too is also, you know, are we building housing near transit? I sponsored a bill called the Build More Housing Near Transit Act, because a lot of people want to use public transit, but they still live far away from it. So what are we doing to shorten those commutes, make transit more accessible, and making the investments? When you look at public transit, the rate at which we subsidize it is that we collect 25% of the fare box. The rest of it is subsidized, and that's perfectly fine. That's okay. But I think sometimes people think that it has to be a complete cost of service model, but that's why it's called public. It's something that we're providing as a public service. So I'm a big fan of it, and any ideas you have about how we can improve service, please let us know. I will work at the federal level and definitely with our local transit agencies.
Is there someone actually I can follow up with about how this might happen in your office?
Absolutely. And as more people move to the South Sound, there's going to be more demand for it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So next up, we have a chat question from Zane Smith. Zane, are you there?
Are you on mute?
Yeah. you're
Yeah,
on.
I'm
There you go.
I'm muted, but I thought the chat question was just gonna get read.
No.
So, well, basically, I recall that the Democrats were saying they wanted to lower the age of Medicare to 60, and of course that hasn't happened. What I'm wondering is if the age was lowered to 60, but Medicare charged more and let people opt in for that service. I mean, literally, if Medicare charged 3 times more than it charges those of us who are over 65, it would still be a bargain for my wife, who is sitting next to me, and she's not 65 yet. So that seems like a more economical way to expand Medicare. It just has to be competitive with the price of medical insurance is now, so they could charge quite a bit more. Like I said, 3 times would still be a bargain.
Okay.
Do you support that sort of expansion of Medicare?
Yeah, I mean, I've not heard that option presented that way. And so I definitely will have Dante take copious notes, and we'll talk about it with our staff. And I've not heard anyone, have you heard of anyone in Congress introducing that?
No, not the way that I've articulated.
Yeah, no, I've not heard that presented.
That's why I'm
Yeah.
suggesting it.
Well, no, and I'll tell you why this is interesting, because, when I was at the city of Tacoma, we had people who had been working there for years, and they stayed working because they didn't want to have to pay COBRA fees for healthcare, and they didn't necessarily qualify. And so, yeah, it's an interesting perspective. So I will definitely take notes of that, and we'll explore it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you. And the next up, we have Lisa Seifert.
Yeah, let me ask that question. Lisa, appreciate your comments, but appreciates especially your comments about not being shy about immigration reform. But she feels like this is the number 3 thing that Congress wants to do, but Congress never seems to get there. Do you see the Democrats pushing any harder on this issue in 2023?
Let me give you an honest answer about this, because I've been there for 2 years now, and so it's easy when you're on the outside looking in. So I believe that getting comprehensive immigration reform is just going to be like pushing this giant boulder up a hill that never gets up there. And I say this in the context of, if we wait for Congress to act. Every time I have a meeting with an employer group, whether it is nurses, doctors, healthcare providers, high-tech people, you name it, what I say to them is, the employer community in this nation needs to come together and propose a comprehensive immigration reform agenda. And despite the divisions, there are moments we have when we can come together. And I believe if the employer community is pushing on Congress, then that's a way to get bipartisan support. And I say this because everyone wants full employment. We want people to get access to decent jobs, and we have a need in this country. But if we wait for Congress to take action, I just feel it's going to continually get ensnared in this tangled web of drama and division. And one of the things that people don't know when we talk about comprehensive immigration reform is that it typically gets turned into a wedge issue that focuses exclusively on the southern border, when less than 20% of the people in this country who are undocumented even come from the southern border. Most people who are here undocumented have come on a plane and they've overstayed their visas. And these are people from all over the world. And so I think there's a way to reframe the conversation, understanding that we have humanitarian crises happening, but also understanding that this is an economic issue. We want more people paying into these legacy systems. People who are here already have been here most of their lives. There should be a path to citizenship. This is our ability to find workers to do the jobs. And this is not an anti-American thing where people say, well, we have plenty of people here in the country who want to do this work. It's like, and they're welcome to it, but we still need more workers. And so my position on this is, let's find a way for the employer community of all sectors to come together and press on Congress and say, there's bipartisan support for this. You all need to act on this. And I think what ends up getting hung up on is that we try to boil the ocean. Immigration reform is complicated, but what are the top 5 things we could do to move forward and get a yes on? Let's just move the ball down the field. Let's not worry about getting into the end zone for now. And I think that's a pragmatic way to approach this and actually make some progress, because believe it or not, 20 years ago, we were on the verge of having this, and then it just all fell apart.
Thanks very much.
All right, we've got a couple hands up. I'm going to go to Ellen Floyd.
Yes, we talked about transportation. I want to go back to the I-5 corridor, and federal funds can be directed a number of ways. And ultra high-speed rail, California was even alluded to the stretch between Sacramento and San Francisco, but here the ultra high speed rail is different from a higher speed rail that's in the Amtrak Cascades project. And that plan could be possibly completed by 2030, and it would speed up. And if it were electrified, it would also have a climate impact. But ultra high speed rail is something that a lot of people like. It's sort of, I don't know, it has a panache to it or something, but to do the Amtrak Cascades plan really would help with those problems that were raised earlier about the I-5 corridor. And it could be safer. It's a track that's already there and a little bit of adjustment, but not taking whole pieces of land. And anyway, please address that about the use of federal funds and how practical we can be here in the I-5 corridor for the more short term. Thanks.
Yeah, the challenge with the rail system is that it's often, I'm not going to say a conflict, a negotiation between moving freight and moving passengers. And so you have to negotiate, who's going to get access to those tracks, what time of day. And that even applies with Sound Transit, the commuter rail that we have going from, Tacoma to Seattle. And so I think the question is what can we do to add more service? And, Amtrak, I sit on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I'm also, vice chair of the Committee on Rail. And so, we've talked about doing is making sure that we're, number one, fully funding Amtrak, that we are doing what we can to, improve its performance and its routes, but also too, recognizing that, we have a system that already exists. So let's expand that and make it better, but it doesn't mean that it is an either or. It's like we can expand Amtrak and make it better, and we can build ultra high speed rail. I don't think it's an either or proposition. We can do both. It's yes and. And the thing about the high speed rail project is that it has a lot of support from the private sector as well, and it has the support of the Canadian government, the state government in Oregon, and so there's a lot of momentum behind that because Washington State wouldn't carry the full price tag for it. But I think it's a yes and. We can do both.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Dennis Larkin.
Yeah, thank you, Joni. Representative Strickland, my question is about the Supreme Court and the courts in general, but specifically the Supreme Court, which we now are living with a multi-decade strategy on the right to capture the courts, in my view. There was a presidential commission to study the court and make recommendations, and I don't know, that didn't get much publicity. But generally, it's things like term limits, code of ethics, expand the court, seem to be the major ones that have come out. I'm interested in your analysis of how we got here, not just the Supreme Court, but right on down through the judiciary. And B, what positions would you support to maybe restore the independence of the judiciary, especially at the Supreme Court level?
Yeah, it's been, I go back to 2016 in that election where we were told repeatedly that the president of whoever won the presidential election was going to appoint a lot of justices given the age and tenure of some of them. And this actually came true. And so, on the one hand, I support the idea of expanding the Supreme Court, but I ask myself too, am I wanting to expand it only because we have a court now that is doing everything against our interests, right? And so I think the conversation becomes, how much integrity is there in the system? We had justices who were, during their confirmation hearings, lying about their positions on issues. This is how we ended up with the Roe v. Wade debacle. And so how do we maintain the integrity of that? As far as term limits, I think that just depends on the age of the person when they're appointed. And so I think that would need more study from me. But I do know that there has been a call to expand the number of Supreme Court justices because of who we have and the composition of it right now. And so I know staff is monitoring the Judiciary Act of 2021, which is going to reform the entire system, change the number of justices, and the bill has been referred to the subcommittee on courts. So that's in play right now. And then there's the Supreme Court Ethics Act, right? I mean, let's talk about what went down with Justice Thomas and his wife's involvement in January 6th, right? And so there are some things that are very, very questionable. I think the question becomes, what kind of power does an executive or legislative body have to hold people accountable to make sure that the court is simply interpreting the law and not becoming activists or twisting the definition of what it means, which basically ends up taking away our rights.
Thank you.
All right, we're at the at 10:54. So rather than ask another question, I think that we will give Representative Strickland this time to make her closing statement.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and your very thoughtful and thorough questions. We have a lot on our menu at this time in our nation. And as I mentioned earlier, this election in 2022 is really the difference between choosing freedom and choosing oppression. We want to make sure that, as we go through our legislative process, that we are always taking input from the people that we represent. But also for me, as a legislator, making sure that we focus on taking the win. Sometimes we're not going to get everything we want, but we can make a lot of progress. And I think that's very important, especially for the American people. We are challenged right now because, the cost of living is high, even though prices are starting to inch down. I think for some people, there is a national narrative that's out there that basically says that every challenge faced at the local level is somehow caused by people at the federal level. And this is not someone shirking responsibility, because I've served in local government, but I understand too that the local, state, and federal government can work together to improve the quality of life. So much of the work that I've done in my first term is really about getting resources to local communities, whether that's through infrastructure, whether it's, reducing the cost of prescription drugs through the Inflation Reduction Act, but staying focused on the people here at home. That's what matters most. And so having organizations like Indivisible, asking questions, suggesting policy ideas. What I love the most about you guys is that you talk about what the issue is, and then you suggest something that we can do. I mean, that's a very, very important component of how we're able to write bills that are successful. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing. I thank you so much for just being a big part of our community. And I tell people this, my office has recovered over $6 million of money owed to people in the district through the IRS, through Social Security, through the VA. So we're recovering money for people. And when people call my office saying, I've had a hard time with this agency, can you help me? I'm not checking their political affiliation at the door. My job is to help the people in my district and represent them well. So whether we're in the majority or minority, I'm always going to continue to fight for our district and to deliver for the people here at home. But I thank you so much for letting me be here today. You're a big part of why we're able to be successful. And I look forward to continuing working with Indivisible.
Thank you so much, Representative Strickland. We're just so grateful that you would take some time in order to talk with us. I want you to know that you have been heard and that we continue to be willing and eager to work as partners with you and all the issues that we have in common. And I think we have a lot of issues in common. But
indeed,
as you noted, it's a big job. You've got a lot on your plate. We know that, and we want to help. Thank you also to everybody who has come and sat in and asked questions. Everybody, thank you so much. Remember that this is recorded, and so we will put this on our website. That is, each visible group can put it up on their website, and so we'll do that. And again, Representative Strickland, I hope you have a good day.
Right, and thank you very much.
Questions all over again, but again, thank you so much.
All right, nice to see you all.